Joining me today as a keynote speaker to Manitoba's Missionfest this weekend at Church of the Rock is Brian Hogan. We're so excited to have him. A little bit about Brian. He is the president of Disciple Making Mentors. He's also a church planting coach and frontier mission leader with YWAM, or Youth with a Mission. Brian, thank you for joining us.
Oh, thank you for having me.
Absolutely, my pleasure. So I would love to know a little bit about your time as a missionary in Mongolia to start, if that's okay.
That's great. Yeah. Um, my wife and I had been missionaries on the Navajo Indian Reservation, and God, through a course called Perspectives on the World Christian Movement, got our attention for unreached people groups. And we realized that the indigenous people that we were working with were already reached. They were sending their own missionaries already. And so we, at that point, wanted to be available to God to go to completely unreached people groups with no church. And we were captivated by the idea of church planting movements, of being able to launch a discipling movement that would self-generate disciples, just like in the book of Acts. So Mongolia opened up to the gospel right after that point, in the early 90s, and our family moved there. And it was chaotic. It was like the Old West or something. It's like there was no rules, no laws. Everything was just, there was no food in the stores. But we began work on a multinational church planting team. We had Swedes and Russians and Americans working together to plant this church in a city called Erdenet. We started out with 14 teenage girls who got baptized in January of 1993. And in 3.5 years, we'd finished. We'd actually raised up leaders. They were planting daughter churches, already had planted a granddaughter church, and we knew the movement was underway. So we passed the baton to them and left. And the movement is still going strong. We just celebrated 30 years with them last year. So it's been an incredible, incredible thing that God did there, way beyond the abilities of anybody on our team.
I can only imagine going to a place like you don't necessarily speak the language, you've never been there, it hasn't even been reached, like you said. Um, what continued to fuel you as you kind of stepped into this like fear of the unknown and as you started to get going, like, can we actually do this?
Well, there were so many barriers. Not only did nobody had ever heard of Jesus, but nobody we met had ever met an American before. I mean, that's how it had been completely closed until just before we went. And there were so many barriers, and we kept getting doors completely slammed in our face and thinking it's impossible. But God had told us so clearly, and there'd been so many clear words that we kept pushing forward, and God did miracles, got us in, just in starting the work, and then as we discipled the believers, He continued to do actual miracles, including we had someone raised from the dead. We had sick people healed, lame people walk, lots of demons cast out, all sorts of signs and wonders. It was an amazing, amazing time. And because we started out with teenage girls, they weren't able to really reach older people. But God showing up and doing miracles pushed us over that edge. And suddenly we were the only church in the entire country that had older people giving their lives to Jesus because God showed up and proved who He was, made His name great in Mongolia.
Wow, thank you for sharing that. That's incredible. You were already talking about daughter churches and then granddaughter churches. Why, according to you, is it important to train locals to continue this ministry?
Well, the simple answer is they actually do it so much better than we do. So the Lord had led us to do everything in an incredibly simple manner, not complicated like we do church in the West, but rather than taking a potted plant to the nations, we took a seed and made it really simple. And we did everything in a way where we wanted the local believers to watch us do something and say, I could do that. And and eventually our goal became that they'd say, I could do that better than him. But And so we were able to hand things over to them. What we found is that everything that they took on, every ministry that they began doing, worked better. They did it better because where we were struggling to not only be biblical, which wasn't a huge struggle for us, but to be culturally sensitive and correct, they didn't even have to think about that. They didn't have to expend one brain cell on getting it right for their neighbors because they were in it. So it just works so much better to have the Holy Spirit and the locals taking these things over and doing them. And that's why we could leave after just 3.5 years, knowing that it would continue strong and we'd done what we came to do.
That is incredible. For people who are showing up at Mission Fest this weekend, maybe considering getting into some sort of missions work, what would you say to them?
Well, I'm going to be sharing a more complete version of the thumbnail story that I just gave you. And what I've found, I share pretty extensively in this class perspectives on the world Christian movement, around the world even. And people are inspired because they see someone totally normal, somebody with, I'm not Joel Osteen, right? So they see that and they go, I could do that. And we get the same reaction from Western believers thinking, oh, I thought this was so impossible. I thought it was these missionary heroes that were so unattainable. And all I could do was pray and send money. But now I'm feeling like, well, I could go and see the world change. And God is willing to do that through me. He's not looking for anybody great and fantastic and wonderful. He's looking for somebody who's obedient and says, yes, Dad. And so I think that's what people get from it.
Absolutely. I think that's very well said. And I know I've done that in my own life where it's like, yeah, these people come back and you're like, wow, they were in prison or they like, and they didn't freak out because of their faith. But then you're like you said, God uses those who say yes. And I think it is that simple, which is pretty
Yeah.
incredible. Is there anything else that you wanted to share today?
Um, our ministry now it has continued to focus on two main things: on launching movements in places where the church isn't. And so we're working in a lot of countries in Southern and Eastern Africa, but also other places around the world, Azerbaijan and everything. And so I travel and I train the locals to do what we did. The other thing, though, that we've become involved in recently and that we're going to be doing a breakout session about at Mission Fest is unengaged people groups. That at this point, 2,000 plus years after Jesus gave us the Great Commission, there's still people groups with no boots on the ground. They're completely left out, not resistant, not, missionaries laboring away, just nothing. And so we've taken that list and along with others have divided it up. And Disciple Making Mentors, our organization, is responsible for 7 people groups in China that are completely unreached and unengaged. And we're mobilizing Mongolian believers to go to them because they're closer and there's a connection, there's a cultural connection with these 7 groups and everything else. So the Mongolian church is the best positioned and they send missionaries like crazy. So it's working really well. But we're also mobilizing Western believers to pray for these groups specifically because they've never received any prayer in the history of the world. And so we have a prayer guide and a website, and that's one of the things we're going to be giving at Mission Fest as a practical aid to people to engage with
I love that.
God's unchanging task.
Nice. Well, we will let everybody know that Brian Hogan will be speaking Saturday at 10 a.m. as well as Saturday 7 p.m. at Missionfest Manitoba. Brian, thank you for coming all the way to Winnipeg and for sharing your beautiful gift.
Well, thank you for having me in Winnipeg. And if you want to turn on the heater, anytime is good.
Yeah, I'm like, it's a little cold for you. Anyway, really appreciate your time.
Thank you so much.